Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Going into round 10 of the candidates, Jan Nepomniachtchi was a point clear of the rest of the field, and he seems to be adopting the strategy, his successful strategy, from the previous candidates tournament by playing ultra solidly. So he had white against Rajabov and didn't test Raja too much. You can see this is the final position. Totally symmetrical. So that was a draw fairly quickly. So the question was, could Fabiano Caruana gain a bit of ground by winning his game? So in some ways that put the pressure on him actually. Caruana had black against Duda, Jan-Krzysztof Duda, 24-year-old from Poland, not having such a great tournament. Anyway, let's see what happened here. So Caruana would very much like to win this game. No Petrov. Instead, Caruana wants more complexity in the position. And it's a gioco piano. Knight f6 and d3. So Duda keeps the tension. And, this can be played in so many different ways. Is white going to play an early bishop g5? Or do you play h3? Do you delay castling for a bit? Do you bring this knight over early? I mean, the move order variation is just mind-blowing here. A5 has come to prominence, I don't know, over the past 2 or 3 years, stopping white expanding like this. But it does allow white to use that b5 squares. There are pros and cons to all these moves. But Caruana played a6. And Duda wanted to gain a bit of space on the queen side. Rook e1, h3. It's not really to stop the bishop coming here. It's actually to stop a knight coming into g4. Bishop e6. So Caruana exchanges off that excellent bishop on c4. And Duda expands on the queen side. It's not just about gaining territory. It does mean that later on, white might be able to play a rook to a2. It could be useful to defend that pawn, or it just clears the second rank anyway. Could just be that the queen is useful somewhere on the second rank, guarding that pawn. Just improves communication in the position, and of course makes queen b3 is kind of a nice follow-up to all this anyway. Caruana starts his initiative on the king side. So, I mean, he needs to balance the play, white's play on the queen side. And, this does look quite dangerous. The bishop looking down here, semi-open f-file, and the knight perhaps would like to hop into f4. Rook a2, in fact, was played by Garmain Jones against Jorn van Foreest, and actually Garmain got a very good position in that game. Ended up losing. That was in latest Champions Chess Tour tournament, actually. Strikes me as being a very logical move, just to keep everything rock solid there. It's very hard for black to actually break through in these kind of positions. So, I mean, the game went like this. And exchange on a7, king h2, just protecting that pawn. And the knight was driven away, and actually, white is very, very solid here on the f-file. That knight can be protected very easily. And white is definitely better there. So let's come back here. So knight h5 just played. Rook a2 has been played previously. But knight d2 is also very reasonable. And the knight drops back here to defend the king side. So yeah, also very sensible. Queen f6, supporting the knight. Still, black's little initiative looks quite nice. Of course, there's now a threat to take on h3 and then take the knight here. Duda therefore decides to just get rid of that knight and plays queen b3. So the queen in a really nice position, looking at that pawn, but also can perhaps support the b pawn. And here Caruana makes what for me is a very understandable decision, but it turns out it's a mistake. Queen f6 is a better move than rook f6. So this was not played. So the queen defends the pawn, that's the first thing. And if b5, the knight can happily swing over to the king side, and black's queen side is secure here. If the queen tries to invade, actually this is just way too slow. I mean, this is a huge attack. The queen really is in Siberia here. You can see black's attack just happening very quickly. Queen g2, mate threatened. Rook here, and then you take on d3. I mean, all black's pieces in the attack. This is absolutely crushing. Now, of course, white certainly doesn't need to go on a wild goose chase with the queen. You know, you can just play something like this, bolster the knights. You know, it looks more comfortable for white. But, you know, there's absolutely nothing clear as yet. Let's go back. But instead of queen f6, and I sort of understand why Caruana didn't want to play queen f6. He didn't want to retreat. He played rook f6. You know, he wants to bring the rook up, you know, maybe even triple on the f-file. You know, he wants some initiative on the king side. But this is a mistake. b5 in this position is strong. And here's why. If the knight drops back to e7, that's where it wants to go. It wants to head for the king side. White takes. Invades with the queen. Now this is very different because the rook is now attacked. If it moves over, then of course just queen takes bishop. So this rook has to retreat. And now the pawns can be taken with impunity. This is just way too slow. Completely different story to the last variation we looked at. You know, here queen e6 check is threatened. This is just not happening for black at all. You know, like this, check, just bring the queen back. You know, white has taken so many pawns. And once the queen comes back to defend, black doesn't have anything. So b5 just played. Knight a5, hitting the queen, and now the queen just comes back to a2. So the queen still eyes that pawn on e6, so black always has to take care of it. Also covers the f2 square, that's useful. And also keeps that knight locked out of play, and it's going to take a very long time for that knight to get back into play. I mean, it's not that white can win that piece, it's just rather sidelined. You know, ideally Caruana would want to have the knight over here somewhere on the king side, but not a5. Knights on the rim, I'm afraid, are very grim. Springe am Rand, bringt Kummer und Schand, and all that stuff. And here, again, I think Fabi's next move, well, he rolls the dice, basically. He could still drop back with the queen. I think it's a nice position for white. The knight is poor, but it's still playable for black. But instead, he plays g5, and I think that's played out of, well, of course, it's ambitious. It's very ambitious, but also I sense a certain frustration here. You know, normally, I know Fabiano plays some wonderful attacks, but often he does so in a very measured way. He builds up very carefully. And this is not his kind of attack. He would realise that this is basically a punt. It's not great. So, for example, if h5, then let's just close this diagonal. d4, look at these minor pieces, dreadful. Whereas white's knights look fantastic here. If g4, I mean this really isn't going anywhere, you play g3, the queen has to drop back and you take on g4 and just wins material. So this kind of brazen attack just doesn't cut it, doesn't cut through. Rook g6 played, d4 anyway, very sensible, just cutting the bishop out of play. h5, the queen is driven back, and now rook d1, no drama, just defend the pawn. So white's centre looking nice, the knights support each other, and g4, well, it just doesn't have a great effect. This didn't happen, but let me just show you what could possibly happen. First of all, let's make sure these are really, terribly weak. Doubled, isolated, dreadful. The d file is now open, and the knight just hops into h4. So white's kingside is absolutely secure, and the rook is hit. It's not a good position for black at all. So Fabi drops the rook back to g7. He's kind of perhaps still toying with the idea of g4 and just nudging the rook back. King h1, very careful, just stepping out of this diagonal, not that there was a particular threat. And again, g4 just doesn't really work. The knight hops here. Rook e3, that's coming to f3 to hit the queen. And rook f4, that makes room for this knight to come here. This is a nice variation actually. Knight here, queen c5, the queen's been driven away, queen takes e6 check, and now the queen is so far out of play. You know, white is just breaking through with the aid of all these pieces. That'll be mate very shortly. Okay, let's come back here. King h1 has just been played, stepping away from the diagonal. Rook f8, reasonable on the semi-open file. And now this is really interesting. Duda, first of all, he takes on e5. He's ready for it. And he plays h4. So this is a great decision. You know, he realizes actually his pieces are so good, he can even open up the king side and turn to attacking black's king, because these minor pieces just don't play any role in the game. Pawn takes pawn. Now, not knight takes, because got to be careful here, but pawn takes. Really simple. He has the g5 square for the knight. Caruana brings the bishop back into play. Rook g1. There we go. Bishop d6. Okay, this is his idea. Yes, the bishop is more active here, but Caruana feels the need just to close the d file because that rook has potential to break through. Knight g5, attacking the pawn. King h8. Here, well, it's actually possible to take that pawn. And in this position to play queen d5, because you know that knight defends the king so well. In fact, that's quite secure. And knight g5. And white goes on the attack. That was very strong. I mean, there's a couple of subtle moves in there, but Duda was taking no chances. He just swept the queen over, and why not? Attacking the pawn. And now he brings rook number 2 into play. And here he didn't recapture. He just played rook g3. So now knight e6 is threatened. The queen dropped back. In fact, it's possible to take on e6 in this position. You can just do this, because after queen takes, you can take there. And after rook takes here, queen takes allows mate, and otherwise this is looking pretty desperate. I mean, white still needs to find a few good moves. White should be winning that, but Duda, well, just played very practically actually. You know, he didn't want to make a mistake with his calculation. He just captured here and maintained this very powerful position on the king side. That knight is still not great. Queen f1. Now he put his queen on g2. This looks quite menacing, to put it mildly. Queen h3. There's a bit of shuffling here. He did play it very safe. Attacks e6. Rook g2 defends the pawn. Finally, the knight is going to return to play. But just when it's coming into play, Duda hits out with knight h7. That's a nice move. So if that's taken, then rook takes rook. If rook takes g3, knight takes f6. There's a beautiful move. Rook takes rook, knight takes queen. And my favourite one, rook takes queen, checkmate. That's a beautiful mating pattern. So knight h7 has just been played. Attacking here and attacking here. So rook g6 sort of keeps things together. And the knight hopped back. So the queen is about to come over to f3, so rook f6. And now f4. So this is really going for it. Well, if that's taken, there are some nice tactics actually. So if rook takes, then knight takes e6 is very strong. Double attack. And if pawn takes pawn, queen f3 is a very, very subtle winning move. Attacking this one, if that's defended, e5. Attacks these two pieces as well as the knight. And so white wins material. Okay, let's go back. So f4 played. Knight c5. Finally the knight comes into play, but it is too late. Okay, question for you. How does white win material in this position? Duda took his time, but he got there in the end. Cheers, folks. That is a lovely slurp of tea. Now, white to play and win material. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes. Knight f3. Simple. Double attack again. The rook hits the queen. The knight hits the bishop. And there's no good defense. So Caruana had to give up this piece. And these last few moves, well, they're very simple. Because white's king is so safe here. And little by little, Duda can just make absolutely sure that he's winning and creep in. If queen takes, then this leads to disaster. There's a nice discovered check. Or a discovered attack on the queen, rather. Let's come back here. So knight f2. I'll just play through these moves very quickly. You can see Duda is a piece up. And there are no complications. And Caruana had to beg for an exchange of queens because his king was in trouble. Black has two pawns, but it's not a difficult position. Now it's only one pawn. And that was the final move of the game. King f4. Just one little trick. So basically the idea is white's pieces are just heading in to the position. And actually there's going to be a direct attack on black's king. Black's king will be driven back. And here's the trick. If rook g4, black does not win a pawn because knight f5 check wins the rook. So there we are. So that's the final position anyway. King f4, and white basically is about to cruise in with all the pieces. So a very disappointing game from Fabiano Caruana, and that meant that Nepo's solid policy paid off. So the scores after 10 rounds, Jan-Krzysztof has 7 out of 10, 7 points. He's 1.5 points ahead of Caruana, Nakamura and Ding. Nakamura and Ding both won very good games. So 3 players on 5.5 chasing. Only 4 rounds to go. It's looking very good for Nepo, let's just say that. But what's interesting is the battle for second place. Because if Carlsen doesn't defend his world title, then whoever comes second will get a shot at the title himself. They'll be playing Nepo. So second place is, the battle for second place is almost looking more interesting than the battle for first place. Anyway, it's not over yet. In round 11, Nepo has black against Firuz Jar. That's an interesting one. We know that Ali Reza really likes to go for it, so that's an interesting one. Nakamura faces Rapport, and Caruana has white against Ding. That's a fascinating pairing. There we go. Thanks very much for watching.